As upstanding Western citizens, we are told to preserve and improve our bodies, our minds, and our environment. This makes sense, we think, as we will be more likely to survive that way. It's curious, therefore, that arguably the two most influential and enduring works of Western art in the last half-century are ideologically rooted in the destruction of this pillar of life. Comparing Apocalypse Now and Fight Club, what conclusions can be drawn about the development of Western society, and specifically about disillusionment among young American men? Released 2 decades apart, Apocalypse Now and Fight Club's parallels are immediately apparent. After critically and publicly acclaimed early careers for Francis Ford Coppola and David Fincher, they had been given astronomical budgets for their respective films, both of which were logistically and conceptually ambitious adaptations. Following arduous processes of making and marketing their films, due in part to the aforementioned ambitions, upon release they were both rejected by critics, who either felt crushed by the weight of philosophy to the detriment of their enjoyment, or couldn't seem to reconcile the visceral content of the films with their spiritual rumblings. Vincent Canby in the New York Times cited Apocalypse Now's delusions of grandeur as its downfall, whilst Roger Ebert suggested the same of Fight Club, a thrill ride masquerading as philosophy. Shortly after their release, both films were reclaimed, however, by most critical and public communities as masterpieces, where they are now paradoxically seen as mainstream, cult, blockbuster, and cerebral. As time has drawn on, they have become considered by many as the socio-cultural emblem of their eras, representative of a certain type of disillusioned American man as he emerged inconspicuously into society. This presents a strange question connecting 1979 and 1999 as the release dates of Apocalypse Now and Fight Club. How were two nihilistic existential films depicting a man, disillusioned yet obedient to his system, narrating his own descent into madness as he navigates a brutally violent world to encounter a chaotic cult at the end, released 20 years apart and considered characteristic of their time and to some extent of present-day mindsets? Even the greatest optimist would be unlikely to deny that this evidence indicates the American man's perpetual disenchantment with his institutions. Should we be worried that these films still resonate with so many people? What do you do as a young American man in the late 60s and early 70s when you want to release your inherently masculine urge for violence? Why, you go to Vietnam, of course. What do you do in 1999 when you want to release your inherently masculine urge for violence? You join a fight club, or so David Fincher would have it. Like the drafted soldiers in Vietnam, many of Fight Club's attendees uncovered their burgeoning lust for destruction upon throwing their first punch, or in Vietnam's case, firing their first shot. Like many of the patriotic young men who volunteered to go to war in the late 1960s, the men in Fincher's film actively seek out fight clubs. However, the differences in their cinematography reveal the irrelevance of this similarity. Where Fight Club is gloomy, overcast, and claustrophobically dank, Apocalypse Now is sprawling and disorientating in its sheer visual variation. In Fight Club, everywhere is a hiding place. In Apocalypse Now, everywhere is exposed. The monotony of dismal urban America provides the same emotional paralysis as the sensory overload in Vietnam, and the men in both settings are revitalized by mindless violence and destruction. 20 years apart, according to the original writer Chuck Palahniuk and David Fincher, the director of the film, American men sought the same escape from their daily lives in their own cities as they did in their hell on earth in Vietnam. The word dehumanization often arises when speaking of soldiers in war, as they carry out degrading tasks under the command of their generals. They sought, perhaps, to humanize themselves in Vietnam by carrying out extra-professional acts of violence, reclaiming the human privilege to feel the cause and effect of their individual actions. Following this thread, the command of advertising and consumerism is presented as a dehumanizing force in Fight Club. The emotionally desensitized men humanize themselves by reverting to their most primal instinct, fighting. To feel flesh on flesh, to cause another pain, or to feel it yourself is how to feel alive in a mind-numbingly isolated society. Although the war ended, the savagery it ignited were an antidote for dehumanization decades later. We are teased into the chaos of Vietnam through Captain Willard. He's our eyes and ears, the comfortingly familiar world weariness of his narration sympathizing with each generation of disillusioned man, starting with the Vietnam vets in the late 70s. The narrator in Fight Club replicates this impassioned cynicism from the beginning, blandly recounting his hyper-consumerist lifestyle to evoke the same unfortunate relatability from 90s office slaves as Willard's cycle of tours and trauma would have evoked from Vietnam veterans. Willard and the narrator can represent a large number of American men through their looks alone. White, average height, brown, forgettable hairstyle, young but not too young, not overly charismatic. In short, a template onto which the disenchanted men of America may place themselves. Once characterized as the disenchanted American man, above and beyond their physical appearances, both Willard and the narrator must embark on a journey of self-realization with which they'll take these disenchanted men of America. Willard is newly divorced, newly returning to Vietnam, evidently friendless and acting at the whim of his superiors. The narrator is similarly unattached. He floats amongst single-serving friends dictated by consumerist delusions. The destruction of his condo removes his final anchor to the world. Like Willard, he becomes a truly blank slate, ready to find himself. Of course, in their obedient search in service of American values, Willard for patriotic loyalty and the narrator for the re-establishment of his consumerist identity, they wind up finding the antitheses of these supposed bastions of society. The discovery of these seeming embodiments of anti-civilization causes both of their worlds to come figuratively and literally crashing down around them. These so-called discoveries are Colonel Kurtz and Tyler Durden, violent leaders of obedient cults spewing out nihilistic rhetoric as an answer to broken American systems of war and consumerism. Within these ostensibly stable but profoundly unhinged men, both Willard and the narrator find themselves and deny their fundamental principles to become them. Upon confronting Kurtz, Willard finds the beast within him that he has denied for so long, covering himself in mud and reverting to an uncharacteristically primitive form of assassination. The narrator finally lets go, as Tyler previously told him to, when faced with Tyler for the last time, willing to risk his own life to free himself from his self-image. Ironically, although both Willard and the narrator kill the men that represent the rejection of all their defining learned principles, they must become those men to do so. The fear that both Willard and the narrator have of their respective alter egos, if we can call them that, reflects a fundamental fear of un-Americanism, of abandoning the safety of their American values. However, there's also an interesting cultural side to this debate. Kurtz's cult and Project Mayhem suppose revealing cultural assumptions that the rejection of Western values will unequivocally lead to chaos, death and destruction, perhaps indicates a belief in our socio-political righteousness in relation to third world nations, where Joseph Conrad's original novel Heart of Darkness and Coppola's film are set, and a presumption that our society's cultural constructions are inherently more civilized than any alternative. However, the continual escalation of their respective cults also suggests that America's omnipotent cultural and political influence can only be actively resisted to be avoided. The only way that Kurtz and Tyler see that they can maintain their stance is to embrace the uncivilized with an increasingly tight grasp, killing more people, causing more mayhem. The final act of destruction is carried out and endured by our original protagonists, confirming their conversion to anti-civilization and the rejection of their American values, wiping the slate clean for the next man. Apocalypse Now and Fight Club begin and end with explosives. The content of the films would suggest that our narrators are telling us to obliterate our ideologies and our pillars of civilization, but considering these films in relation to each other, a different message comes out. You can destroy trees, forests, or banks to protest the system, but someone will still need to come back in 20 years to do it again.